Hello, everyone. Welcome to this ISDP webinar on climate crisis in Tibet. Let me welcome all of you from Stockholm. I'm Jagannath Panda. I head the South Asian Indo-Pacific Center at ISDP. We are fortunate to have this project covering the geopolitical developments in the Himalayan regions. For last 6 months at the Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs at ISDP, we were tracking the developments in the Himalayan regions. Now, for next few months or so, we are going to cover the developments in Tibet, what's happening in Tibet, and particularly when the global community have started raising alarm about the climate conditions in Tibet. And they have started saying that there is a crisis emerging because Tibet is quite critical. It is the third pole, known as a third pole of the world. In a way, it is known as the roof of the world. And it covers a vast canvas of geographical regions with 2.5 million square kilometer with rich biodiversity and natural resources. And that's why the global community really focuses on Tibet. Of course, there are two sides of the story attached to the Tibet. There is a story that Chinese government portrayed to the world that they are carrying out a lot of developmental works in Tibet. But that's not the way the rest of the world really thinks. And I think there has been alarming opinion pieces and positions have been taken globally by many climate activists and also by many intellectual experts and climate activists. They do share their concerns that Tibet is not in a healthy position what it used to be because of continuous infrastructural development plan and continuous melting of the glaciers in the regions, and a lot of activities that the Chinese government and China is undertaking in Tibet that is actually eroding the climate conditions in Tibet, leading to a climate crisis in the region. Now, in order to discuss this, we have a fantastic set of experts to discuss about this. We have Dr. Ute Wallenberg. She is actually a research associate at the Department of Mongolian and Tibetan Studies at the University of Bonn. She has an academic background in sinology and Tibetology, which is an interesting combination she's having. And she's a doctorate holder from Chinese Studies at the University of Vienna. Before Germany, actually, she worked in different academic, capacity and positions, including in Czech Republic and in Austria, Vienna. Her research centers on the Sinophone and Tibet-phone borderlands, along with the Tibetan diaspora in Asia and Europe, has been one of those, keenly followed, academic discipline, academic department and research curriculum by wider community. So welcome, Ute. So we are glad to have you. Then we have Dr. Jonathan Ping, who is a political economist as well as a sinologist and who specializes in the study of statecraft. His book, Middle Power Statecraft, established his hybridization theory of the middle power concept. Jonathan has been writing prolifically on China, on China's international relations theory, and on China's strategic priorities and Chinese engagement. He is currently serving as an associate professor at Bond University in Australia and is a founder and director of the East Asian Security Center and editor of the journal East Asian Security. Welcome, Jonathan. Then we have Dr. Mark S. Kogan, who is an associate professor of peace and conflict studies at the College of Foreign Studies at Kansai Gaidai University in Osaka, Japan. Interestingly, Mark is also one of our senior associated research fellow at the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs in ISDP. His research interests includes Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific regions. He also talks about human rights issues and counterterrorism issues. And quite often you will see his writing covering human rights dimensions, covering in the United Nations and in many international forums. So glad to have you, Mark, again for our ISDP events. Then last but not the least, we have Dr. Sering Togpal, who is a political scientist specializing in international relations, Asian politics and security, Chinese politics, and interestingly, Tibetan studies. He teaches courses such as Dilemma in International Relations, International Politics of East Asia, Asia Pacific Security, Chinese Politics and Foreign Policy at the University of Birmingham. Dr. Sering actually is a Tibet specialist, and he focuses on political and security aspects of Tibet. He is the author of the book China and the Tibet: The Perils of Insecurity, which was published in 2016, and he has published in tremendously in high-ranking journals, for example, in Asian Security, Journal of Contemporary China, Pacific Affairs, China Report, etc. He's also closely covering the developments in Tibet and Xinjiang. So glad to have you, Dr. Sering. And a little bit about myself. You are already familiar with myself. I'm Jagannath Panda. I'm heading the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs. We primarily focuses the developments in South Asian regions and Indo-Pacific regions. For last a year or so, we are tracking out the developments in the Himalayan regions, particularly in the China-India relations, in the Himalayan politics, and also the neighborhood politics in the Himalayan regions, now including the Tibetan issues, particularly the climate issues in the Tibetan regions. With this note, let me welcome all of you for this webinar, and we're glad to have you for this webinar. This webinar will be much more interactive. After the webinar, we are going to prepare a report and publish it in our website. You are free to have your opinion, and we are going to follow up a few rounds of webinar of this nature. We are also at some stage possibly going to invite some Chinese experts to share about their side of the story, what China is doing and not doing in the Tibetan regions. So with this note, let's start about today's discussion. Today's discussion actually talks about what is actually changing and not changing in the Tibetan Plateau, and where I think there is a global consensus is emerging that if anything is changing very quickly, that is the climate conditions in Tibet, which is amounting to a crisis. Now, I would open the floor by inviting all of you that how do you see the environmental degradation that is happening in the Tibetan Plateau? In your opinion, what are the primary Chinese objects and how the Chinese are actually going ahead with the developmental plan that is actually amounting to a degradation of climate conditions in Tibet? And what the world communities and the international communities should possibly do. So with this little note, let me invite first Ute to you. Maybe you could share it in 5 to 7 minutes, initial remarks, and then we'll go to maybe Jonathan, then Mark, then Sering to have your remarks, and then we'll go for second and third rounds. And also, we welcome to all of those participants who have joined for this webinar. Please feel free to ask your questions in the chat, in the Q&A box. Either our experts will read those questions or we'll read it for them, and we'll have a engaging discussion later on. So over to you, Ute, for your initial remarks.
Okay, thank you, Jagannath, for the introductory words and also for the invitation to this panel. And as you already said in the beginning, my background is in Chinese and Tibetan studies. I'm not an expert in environmental studies and the climate crisis, but I'm more or less also dealing actually with Chinese sources and Chinese policy papers. And before I think we should start the whole discussion of climate crisis and environmental issues, the most important thing is to understand that there's a different perception of climate crisis and also understanding of environmental protection in a Chinese sense, according to the Chinese policy papers, and to our, I would now let's say, European understanding. In the European sense, in a very general sense, we approach the topic on sustainability, individual responsibility, and also long-term ecological and environmental balance. Whereas from the Chinese perspective, it's everything in terms of climate and environment is influenced by the focus on economic growth, national development, and collective good. And according to Xi Jinping, or whatever Xi Jinping is proclaiming, he promotes continuous stages of high speed to high quality economic growth. And whatever happens in Tibet and it happens within the framework of the so-called ecological civilization and ecological progress. And any of those environmental policies in China are frequently implemented in a top-down manner, prioritizing in industrial expansion and resource utilization. So why then Tibet? Tibet is, as Jagannath, you already mentioned, it is the key player in China's push for energy and economic growth. Tibet is known for these huge hydraulic, solar, and also wind resources, and is standing in forefront of China's renewable energy development. And if you look at the Chinese name of Tibet, it's Xizang, naming the Western storehouse. Zhang, it's the collective, so it's in terms of the resources. So it's it quite makes sense why China renames Tibet to Xizang now, even official paper since 2023. So really focusing on the resources, in my understanding. And and according also to Beijing's narrative, so before using all the resources, Tibet has to be modernized. And we always have to keep in background in terms of China, the CCP, everything is in terms of economic growth. And so officially, all initiative what the CCP is implementing in Tibetan areas are framed officially under the efforts to protect the region's fragile economic systems and addresses also the climate change in a Chinese context. And in Tibet, as we all know, I think there are large-scale infrastructure projects, hydropower dams, resource extraction, and all these projects, China is framing under the so-called green development. And in reality, these evolving factors of land development and this also kind of state control, conservation of the Tibetan Plateau significantly has impact on almost 2 billion people in Asia who are depending on the rivers which are originating on the Tibetan Plateau. And this has undoubtedly far-reaching consequences for the climate, global climate. And China's policies is really putting Tibet's fragile economic system at serious risks. So, but what are the main large projects in Tibet, which have not just recently started, but it started already in the 1990s with the infrastructure projects like the construction of roads, railroads. If we think about the railroads connecting mainland China with Lhasa, and now doing all the high-speed railroads even on the Tibetan Plateau. We have airports established in the grasslands. And all these infrastructure projects, they have a significant environmental challenges, displacing wildlife, altering local ecosystems. And also, we don't have to forget that wherever those, if we stay with infrastructure projects, also refer to people. And local people, the population is moved away. They're forced for resettlement. Officially, these resettlement or the displacement of local people is so-called the environmental resettlement or ecological migration. So just to understand the Chinese nomenclature, what is really going on. And in terms of the so-called migration, it's not only individuals are moving away, whole villages are forced to move under the framework of environmental protection and also for improvement of people's livelihood. And then the second, besides the infrastructure project, we have the mineral resource extraction, especially Tibet, as it's quite known, it's rich in lithium and especially also copper mining and zinc and gold and all these things. And despite the fact that according to Chinese official sources, the authorities regularly inspect the implementation of environmental protection measures as well as they suspend projects that do not meet environmental standards. We still have high water contaminations, and I remember in 2016, for instance, in contemporary Qinghai province, near a zinc mine, a lot of yak, like livestock, died as well as people. But this is completely neglected by the central government. And then last but not least, as the third great project, huge project, are in terms of the water resources, the building of hydroelectric dams. And in the latest report I read, there are currently 193 hydroelectric dams being built and in progress in Tibet. And based on figures of the International Campaign of Tibet, I recently checked, so far 750,000 Tibetans were removed for the construction of these dams. So these dams are not only have impact on daily life, it also causes environmental damages, natural disasters, landslides, floods, water quality is reduced. And this not only happens in Tibet, but as Tibet was the source of the 5 great rivers, it has a great impact also on the neighboring countries. And not only the environmental change, I don't want to even mention by the construction of these dams, the destruction of cultural sites and also religious sites which are happening. And what is not always very known, that in the course of all these environmental policies, CCP's policies, these are also closely linked to the self-immolations in Tibet since 2009. Maybe Tsering will later on also get on it, because those self-immolations mainly, to my understanding, occurred in the regions which were mainly affected by these policies. So those are my first words.
Excellent, Ute, and I think I appreciate your free and frank, views on the subject, and it looks like you have been following these issues very closely, which is coming from your research and experiences. And I do agree with you that I think there is a lack of interest from the Chinese side to probably go to the extent of probably creating some of this infrastructural developmental plan which will meet environmental standard. And at this moment, we could see that some of these standards are not really met, which is causing the damages and resulting these challenges to crisis. And I think international communities should take a note about this. But again, I appreciate your free and frank expression on the subject. With this note, let me invite Jonathan, maybe 5 to 7 minutes to you.
Yep. Thanks, Jagannath, and thanks to the ISDP for putting on these fantastic panels, and I've learned a great deal from these, so thanks very much to everybody else here. That's really interesting, Uti, what you just said. And I agree with you that we need to approach this with an understanding that the Chinese Communist Party has a very different perspective. And I thought it was very important that you pointed out the name even. And once we start looking at the terminology used, and you get to get a greater understanding of some of the barriers to having an effective global climate change policy. So I suppose we need to understand how the Chinese Communist Party works. And the main thing to remember is that it's based on a critical theory. It's based on Marxism, combined with Leninism, Marxism-Leninism, and it's expressed in the modern era as socialism with Chinese characteristics. And really what this means is that the party is omnipotent, the party is the center, and the party leads the working and the peasant class to the socialist utopia. So they're on this pathway towards a specific destination, and there aren't other actors which can have a say in things. And that leads to a very opaque governance structure, which really doesn't allow for a collaborative effort that's required for an effective global climate change policy. And as Jagannath pointed out, Tibet is absolutely critical. Uti, you pointed out that it's a watershed of the world. It feeds billions of people through that water supply. And it's critical that we have this type of global common understanding. My chapter coming out from a Routledge book, Jagannath, you got a chapter in it as well, China's International Relations Theory. I expand on this a lot, but we don't have a lot of time for that now. But I think really what that means is that the CCP can't really put together an effective climate action policy because it's always putting the party ahead of everything else. And so the terminologies that's used and the goals that are being achieved, although Uti, you pointed out economic, they also require a political control. So we don't have non-government organizations in China. We don't have independent multinational corporations. We don't have an attendance to intergovernmental organizations that we do in other parts of the world. And so it means the development, deployment, and management of the globally significant Tibetan Plateau is problematic, to say the least. Look, if I can use an example here that we're probably all aware of, it's very much akin to the outbreak of the pandemic in late 2019, early 2020. And you had Dr. Li Wenliang started discussing amongst his colleagues in Wuhan that he was seeing a SARS-like virus. So the response to that, within the governance structure, was that the local police threatened him for spreading rumors. And then he was effectively silenced by the party because his narrative, his story, wasn't correct thought. And so, do we really know what's going on inside Tibet? Probably not. And I think that we know, as Uti mentioned, to self-immolate is really, beyond imagination, I think, from my perspective. But things aren't very good there in essence. And for us to have an understanding about what's going on there, we really do need to come to grips with the idea about how the party views the world, what its long-term goal is, socialism with China's characteristics, and then it gives us an understanding about what could be the problem there. And I think we've already touched on a few of these already. Big geopolitical implications, watershed imbalances, desertification, black carbon deposition by the coal-fired power stations. So you have China as the main consumer of coal globally. It's producing most of its power from coal, although it has done really well with environmental projects as well. But a lot of the pollution is being produced in China through coal-fired power stations, and that's also a model of power that's being put out through the Belt and Road Initiative. So Pakistan's building coal-fired power stations. I think since 2000, 25 countries have been supported in building 240 coal-fired power plants through the Chinese Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. So there's I suppose there's a broader responsibility to create a development model. I've discussed this a lot in terms of development models, which has an awareness about how the enormous population and economy of China impacts everybody else. And in this case, we're looking specifically at Tibet. It's not ideal for the people of Tibet, obviously. It's not ideal for the people of China. And it certainly isn't ideal for the rest of us. And I've written recently about ways that we can try and enhance this level of cooperation if we actually want to do something about having effective climate change policy. And it'd be great if we do have some Chinese scholars come on and participate. And there are a lot of other projects which Yudi's already touched on. The Yamdrok hydro power station was put up became functional in 1998. The Anhiko hydro photovoltaic power station has been problematic. You've got a geothermal project there, the Yangbi geothermal field. They're mining gold, copper, lithium as well. And look, this is all from state-owned enterprises supported by government policies that prioritise economic development over environmental sustainability. So thanks very much. I'm coming up to 7 minutes there, and I'm very interested to hear what others have to say, and obviously the response from our audience. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And I think I do agree with your point that a lot of things seems to be under CCP control, and that's how the things in Tibet and outside Tibet goes in China, and that is what very problematic. And then you are right about making that last point, that there seems to be prioritizing economic development over environmental policies or environmental protection. That is a worrisome factor, and I think international community must take a strong note of this. We'll come back to you, Jonathan, to provide more details about how the CCP is functioning with regard to Tibet and its climate policy. But Mark, you have been writing about how UN functions, and particularly about human rights issues. But here today we are talking about a very sensitive issues, which is not a sensitive issues only in Tibet or in China. It's a sensitive issues throughout the globe. Climate condition is a alarming issue throughout the globe. But when we talk about Tibet, as you know, it is one of those sensitive issues because, as we mentioned, this is a critical region for the rest of the globe, and the way climate conditions is deteriorating, it is affecting a lot of rights of the Tibetans, as well as affecting the livelihood there. So how do you really see the recent policies of China? And probably you could throw some light about the human rights issues there, and how the international community should collaborate with UN or other forums to talk about it. Over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I thank you for the introduction earlier, and really enjoyed listening to the other panelists. I just want to say that maybe borrow a phrase from Las Vegas. What happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. What I mean by that in the climate change context is what happens in China doesn't stay in China. What happens to Tibet doesn't stay in Tibet, right? Climate change knows no boundaries. It knows no borders, just like the pandemic. It doesn't know any better. It's just simply the environment reacting to the emissions that the human beings largely produce. So when we talk about climate change and we talk about what China is doing to cause, meaning man-made or policy-related decisions that add to the climate crisis in Tibet, we must understand that they won't stay in Tibet. They will impact all of the surrounding areas, because we must look at them like a kind of massive ecosystem, right? So we're talking about Afghanistan, right? We're talking about Pakistan. We're talking about India, or the entire Indian subcontinent. We're talking about Bangladesh as far as Myanmar. Anywhere the rivers go, right? That's one massive ecosystem. And so whatever China does when it comes to riparian ownership, when it comes to hydroelectric power, when it comes to infrastructure development, economic development, right? They're all interrelated, right? So what we see in Tibet will also be amplified elsewhere, right? That's really, really important. So I want to say, maybe answer the second part of your question first. And I don't want to say what China has done first, because it's probably even maybe a lesser important question. It's that international organizations are so unprepared to deal with this nexus of challenges. Okay, there's an old phrase that people use, or secretaries general use, human rights, development, and security. They're all interrelated. You can't have development without security, can't have security without human rights, blah, 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 right? No one ever said, what does security mean? Or no one ever said in the past, well, what about climate change? Climate change intersects with every single one of the core domains or normative areas the UN operates: development, security, human rights, and social justice. But no UN agency, no UN organ is uniquely suited to handle the climate change crisis by itself. And that is simply a result of what we generally call siloed thinking, where everybody has their own domain of focus, own sort of domain of influence, like UN AIDS, UN Women, the UN Refugee Agency, migration, so on and so forth, or the UN Environment Program. But climate change has no either sort of primary focus in any of the agencies, nor is any agency or any institution uniquely purposed to tackle climate change at the most senior level, at the most high level, at the ministerial level or higher. That's really, really important. Okay. So there is no unified approach. This gives, and this goes back to your first question, this gives China a tremendous advantage because it has become uniquely suited to disruption. What I mean by that are terms like not climate change, human rights with Chinese characteristics, global governance with sort of quote unquote Chinese characteristics. They are creating leading international organizations that have a China-centric focus. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the new Global Security Initiative, right? All of these agencies or these international organizations, even more recent ones, are dominated by China. And the other ones have far too not populated enough by Chinese diplomats. And this is really, really important because when it comes to, say, for example, and I'll use an example of how there's a lack of leadership on a variety of issues like this. When it comes to hydroelectric power, for example, this hydroelectric power is replicated not just in the Himalayas, but also along the Mekong River Delta. Right? They've been doing this on major river systems for many, many years. This dates back to the 1980s when they started all this. So this has ramifications for a lot of different countries, but no international organization exists that deals with the side effects or the consequences, which I'm talking about climate change. But really, a lot of countries are still talking about what we call basin-wide or riparian management, where all sides, all affected countries get to dictate the management of river systems, when it comes to fisheries, when it comes to hydroelectric power, when it comes to ecosystem services, delivery, and management, right? And then also the bureaucracy, the functioning of the bureaucracy that manages the expertise, the staffing, and the policies that are generated as a result. So this is really, really important. So we're talking about what China has done, perhaps in the context of international organizations, right? It has a strategic advantage because the UN and international organizations are uniquely unfit for purpose. And the international organizations that China has invested in are doing an effective job, a very effective job of keeping the issues that matter, particularly towards Tibet, at bay. All right, that's my 7 minutes.
Excellent, Mark. And I think, no, I do agree with you on your point that there is no unified approach to talk about some of these issues. Second, how China has invested over the years in some of these international organizations to control the narrative, to control, to take or initiate any kind of action plan to talk about addressing the climate change issues there in the Tibetan regions. I think this is where China should be open, transparent, and forthcoming as not only as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, but also as a major economy in the world. We will come back to you, Mark. Excellent remarks again. Last but not least, sharing. I'm sure you have a lot of inputs to share. Since you have a strong Tibetan origin background, how do you really see more from a Tibet's point of view or Tibetan point of view, the whole episode of climate crisis in Tibet? Of course, there are many issues. One could call it as climate challenges, as anywhere in the world. But some of these challenges are gradually turning as crisis. As we have seen, many international medias and reports are suggesting that there is a crisis emerging. So how do you really characterize and narrate the developments of China pertaining to Tibet and climate change issues? Over to you, 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Jagannath. Thank you for organizing this and including me in this program. I may have come across Ute in some of the Tibet conferences, although we haven't communicated on a personal basis. But it's my first time sharing any kind of stage with Mark and Jonathan, although all three of us seem to be sort of broadly IR and political science kind of specialists. So it's a pleasure and an honor to participate here. I will comment on the questions that you have posed us, Jagannath, but I would like to begin by making a conceptual point about what do we mean by Tibet in a geographical sense, because the Chinese government obviously means by Tibet or Xizang as just the Tibet Autonomous Region. But Tibetan ancestral homelands and, even today, the areas where Tibetans live have been sort of carved up into 5 different political jurisdictions. Tibet Autonomous Region, almost the entirety of Qinghai province, the western portion of Sichuan province, the bit of Gansu province, and the northern tip of Yunnan province. These are Tibetan areas, and even today, Tibetans living in these places consider themselves as Tibetans and their sort of territories as part of Tibet, although they also have to sort of participate in the official names of the provinces as well. I think it's important to point that out because the Chinese effort to replace Tibet with Xizang from that standpoint is unhelpful and doesn't make sense. Second, I also would like to foreground, although, at this point, our focus is on Chinese policies and the impacts, foreground the Tibetan environmental consciousness at the grassroots level and the climate change and environmental anxieties that Tibetans have, and the activism by Tibetans, which is informed both by traditional Tibetan knowledge systems and philosophical systems from the Buddhist or the indigenous religious points of view, but also by modern scientific conclusions. And Tibetans have been very active in deal with environmental changes in Tibet. For example, in 1994, a Tibetan was killed when he was trying to fight with poaching, Chinese poachers killing Tibetan antelopes. And just a couple of years ago, a Tibetan died when he was trying to remove illegal fishing nets from Qinghai province. So there are lots of Tibetan activism on the environmental and climate change front, which needs to be acknowledged as well. And in terms of Chinese policies and the climate change and environmental impacts, I would say that today we are experiencing Chinese policies in Tibet with sort of three prongs. When Hu Jintao became the party secretary in 1989, he came up with the so-called policy of grasping with both hands. On the one hand, using the security forces to crack down ruthlessly against any Tibetan dissent on the one hand, and on the other hand, using development and modernization to sort of win over Tibetans. And Xi Jinping's presidency has led to a third element, which can be called Sinicization, which is essentially securitization of China's national identity and seeing Tibetan distinctive identity as a threat, an enemy to that national effort to construct a Chinese national identity. So all three of these elements, if we break them down, have environmental and climate change impacts. But just to be more specific, with regard to particular policy programs with greater environmental relevance, some of which our colleagues have already mentioned, the infrastructure development, resource extraction, and industrial policies, tourism in Tibet, and Chinese, urbanization and resettlement of Tibetan nomads, also very important sort of part of the story. Water resource management, and cultural and political domination and suppression. But I would also point out militarization of the Tibetan Plateau as a very important sort of agent in climate change and environmental degradation. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops stationed all over the Tibetan Plateau with all their military equipment and gear, moving around during training or other activities. All of that adds to a lot of emission, including black carbon. So these kind of policy elements are especially relevant with regard to the nature of the environmental crisis on Tibet. It is multifaceted and highly serious. And for the Tibetan people, since you asked me about the Tibetan perspective, the stakes are so high that it's a sort of life or death matter for the Tibetan civilization and the Tibetan way of life and Tibetan identity to survive. So rising temperature, in the Tibetan Plateau, scientists have pointed out that the temperature rises 3 times higher than the global average, and since 1960, the temperature in Tibet has been rising 0.2% every decade. And then glacial melting and shrinkage is all, great sort of significance. Permafrost degradation is very, because the half of the Tibetan Plateau is sort of sitting on permafrost. And a melting of the permafrost leads to the release of carbon sort of emissions, as well as decline in the water table, loss of soil moisture, and various other sort of, environmental impacts. Desertification and the degradation of the quality of the land for feeding animals or for agriculture, very important. And the declining water resources, not just for the Tibetans, but also all the countries that rely on Tibetan rivers downstream, whether in mainland China, in Southeast Asia, or South Asia. Loss of biodiversity, as have already been pointed out, air pollution in general, and various kinds of human activities, whether it's the policies, the infrastructure projects, and industrial activities, which leads to essentially the scope of the environmental crisis around Tibet, not just having sort of life and death impacts on Tibetans as a people and a civilization, but also having regional impacts on all the countries downstream, relying on water, as well as the natural disasters that happen because of the way China manages the waters and rivers in Tibet. Also, global impact, because of the altitude of the Tibetan Plateau, it is a major regulator of climate in Asia, and a disruption of that will lead to erratic weather patterns all over the world. So it's not just, as our colleagues have pointed out, not just a matter for the Tibetans, but it will have regional and global impacts.
Thank you, Sering. And I think I do agree with you. The identity of Tibet is being lost, and there is a crisis to the Tibet as a civilization. And I think a lot of things are changing rapidly in Tibet that the international community, along with some of the neighboring countries, should not overlook. And I think there we need a global action plan, not a regional or a Himalayan-based action plan, but a global action plan. With this note, let me open the floor for discussion. And I think your remarks are really setting the debates to unfold. But I'll just point out two specific issues for each one of your comments in 2 minutes. And also at the same time, I will request all of you to look at the Q&A box, because there are already some interesting comments and questions has come. Let me read those questions first, and then I will encourage you to answer for some of these questions. So there is a question from Palmo Tenjin, who is asking that, I'm a researcher and advocacy officer from International Campaign for Tibet. I co-authored our recent report, an interactive map on hydropower expansion across Tibet. Our biggest challenge was transparency of information. It took us almost 3 years to gradually collect data, hydrological data, and even boundary data of nature reserves and national security secrets. What do you think are the potential opportunities to open up scientific research and data sharing on the environment in Tibet? So I would invite all of your comments on this particular aspect. In fact, he has further asked that the environmental issues in this regional ecosystem are not unique to China. India and other downstream neighboring countries are also engaged in individual maximizing activities that harm the ecosystem. One opportunity to open up Tibet to scientific research may be Western powers partnering with neighboring countries to pressure China. This worked in the Mekong in 2020, when a Mekong-US partnership forced China to give a year-round hydrological data. But would India and other countries cooperate? So that is definitely an interesting question to discuss. And then there is a comments from Henrik S. Undisholt. He's from Norway. He is joining, and he's asking that Tibet being the world's third pole, what kind of measurable global climate effects can be directly traced to Chinese economic development in the regions? He further asks that control over Tibet gives China a geopolitical edge over its neighbors and has a real political interest in developing the region in order to increase its leverage. How does that measure up against the need for environmental protection from the CCP's perspective? So with these two questions, let me invite all of you to comments first. And then I will also go for the additional questions I'm having so that we could have a further discussion. I think Mark is raising hand. Maybe first, Mark, you would like to go? Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to say something to Paul Mutensen's question. She's the International Campaign for Tibet. And I just wanted to say that her question is really, really important, because that question does not only concern Tibetan activists or civil society, but it affects the climate scientists and data scientists around the world. This is very much concerned for academics. But you have to also remember that she's not alone in this, and that data sharing and a transparency of data is also a concern for Mekong River countries. So when it comes to, like, for example, transboundary water management issues, sustainable development, all are really, really, really big important. But it's a political issue. Okay, it's not just a political issue for China. It's also a political issue for neighboring countries, particularly even India. So when it came to the Mekong River countries, which is basically Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and then that empties into the South China Sea, some countries don't simply want to share data for sensitivity issues. And the issue was that a lot of the countries have very development policies. They don't have common security arrangements, even though they have common interests, which is like, say, flood prevention, drought prevention, disaster mitigation, things like that, hydroelectric power, things like that. So these issues are really, really important, not only to the scientific community, but across countries. The lack of data sharing erodes trust. It does not promote what you call sort of like effective development cooperation or sustainable development planning. So the answer to your question, to her question, I think, is very, very difficult, extremely difficult, because it's in the nature of the question. Data has become a national security issue, right? Very much a national security issue. So to encourage effective data sharing and transparency of data, they are going to need the support of neighboring countries that demand that data be shared, because that is what is happening along the Mekong River with the Mekong River Commission and a lot of NGOs and civil society groups in the region. So when she's talking about Tibet, as I said before, what happens in Vegas don't stay in Vegas, right? Have to start involving all of the other countries in the region. Otherwise, if you frame it simply as a Tibetan issue, China will simply shut it down, right? You need the corresponding pressure from other countries and the practice from other countries in sharing data when it comes to transboundary issues, hydroelectric power, everything else. So you're going to have to be an example in order for China to be an example.
Thank you, Mark. And I think I do agree with you. But Jonathan, you have raised the hand. So maybe you would like to comment first on these two questions, and then I'll come to Ute to comments on these two questions, then to Sering, and then I'll take a few follow-up questions that I have with me. So over to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, so I'll just add to what Mark was just saying there. I completely agree with that, and it's a global governance issue. And so it's really about us being able to collect enough data. So John Maynard Keynes came up with macroeconomics in the early part of the last century, and we really need to do something to come up with another set of data which we just have as routine information. The collection of data in China is very much politicized around the structures that are set out in early discussions. And I think if you used the World Health Organization and then on to COP29 and for climate, you could expect a similar type of approach from the party. So we really don't know where COVID-19 came from. There was no sort of transparency, and before you know it, we were all into a global pandemic, and this is a very similar situation. It might be moving at a slower pace, but it has much greater consequences for the entire environment, not just a few of us unfortunately becoming ill and dying from it. Look, unfortunately, at the moment, data collection is going backwards. So I was interviewed, I think maybe a month ago or so, from China News Asia about the US-China Science and Technology Agreement, which was signed in 1979. It hasn't been renewed. So we'll see what President Trump does, but it's unfortunately, and I applaud you for getting the data out that you did. It's what we need, exactly what we need.
Yeah, thank you. Ute, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I also agree with Mark and Jonathan. I think they already said more. Most issues all are global governance issues. And we cannot look at only China itself. We have to find a very diplomatic way. And about data collection, me having worked for the past more than 20 years on Tibetan issues and Mongol issues within the PRC, it's really hard. It used to be hard to get data, and it's almost impossible. We have to be very creative. Collaborations on sensitive topics are almost impossible. Cooperation with, I call it Chinese institution or so-called Chinese citizen, is a risk for the local population. So nowadays we have to be very creative in what we're doing and how to get the data. And I'm not sure, like what I heard, the whole situation is a bit getting easier, and also for foreign researchers entering is a bit easier than last year, what I've heard. But I have actually no answer to these questions.
Yeah.
I don't know if Tsering has another approach.
I struggle to answer that one myself.
Yeah.
It's hard to give a real
Yeah.
Yeah. Sharing, over to you. There is a question also, additional questions specifically for you. This is coming from Harman Abid, who is asking about black carbon deposits on the Tibetan Plateau's ice and snowpack. He read that studies suggesting most of it's coming from Southeast Asia by wind, some but less from China. Is there any cross-border cooperation among the involved countries to adopt black carbon reduction targets based on scientific findings and monitoring with shared data methods and standards? So maybe you could answer some of these questions. Over to you.
Okay, on the previous question, and I don't have a lot to add, because I acknowledge, like the previous speakers, the challenge under the present context of data nationalism and on China's part, securitization of data of this type, right? Anyone could get into trouble just for sharing data or information that you or we might think are totally sort of innocuous and harmless. So in not just because of these reasons, but also countries like China, because of the political system, it has always been very protective of information, of data and archives, particularly to do with regions like Tibet. So there's an additional sort of layer of challenge. But I think, it's a huge challenge, but I think recent technological sort of advances may make it slightly easier to access some types of data. Now that there is sort of AI translation tools, you don't have to sort of wait for someone to publish the data or translate in English. If you know where to look, you can also go to the Chinese websites, whether they are official websites or some where we might be able to locate some of the information. So I think that's all I can say. On the question about black carbon deposition, climate change doesn't observe borders, right? It's a transnational challenge, and the black carbon or other sort of global warming emissions that affect Tibet, don't just originate from Tibet or from China, but from other regions. But Chinese policies in Tibet and in adjoining areas of China also contribute to black carbon deposit. Militarization, the military activities, the industrial sort of activities in Tibet, tourism, the greater sort of number of vehicles on the road, the civilian and military airports, airfields, contribute a lot to black carbon and other sort of types of emission, which adds to emissions coming from other countries as well. And it would be nice if countries in the region can come to an agreement on sort of management of black carbon deposition. But if the practice around the sharing of data over water between China and other regions is any precedent, it will be hugely challenging to even achieve that.
Thank you. I think that is excellent. I think in the interest of the time, what I would suggest is that we go for another round. And I would specifically invite your comments on two specific issues. One is that, I do agree here with Jonathan and others that probably many things in Tibet are controlled, that is controlled by the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, and that's how China functions. What are the end goals of CCP when it comes to, Tibet and its climate conditions, the way it is today? There is a crisis emerging, but how does really CCP going to, manage it? And what are the prime objectives of CCP? Is it the prime objective of controlling the regions more, over managing the environment and managing the regions, or how do you really see this? So my first comment is about CCP's objectives. Second is about what the global climate forums could actually do. For example, like UNFCCC, what UNFCCC could do, what forums like International Center for Integrated Mountain Development could do, what could UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change could do. I do agree with you that on the climate change issue, probably the world could not do much. Multilateral forums could not do much because of the Chinese influence. But the time has come, probably we need to talk about this third pole. If we don't talk about today, then there will be a huge disaster for the regions, not only for China, not only for the Tibetan community, not only for the Chinese people, but also for the entire community. So what role probably could UN play, UNFCCC could play, IMOD could play? Maybe I'll start with Mark. I know you cover some of these issues very closely. So could you please throw on some lights, the policy part, the policy prescription? What could be the approach? What should be the approach? And how should we build this consensus in order to either talk to China, bring to a negotiating or dialogue table, or pressurize China to do something? Your take on Mark.
Yeah. So let me let me start with the second part of the question. And I think you're kind of I guess you were maybe combining some of the questions, but you know, the issue, I think, is that for the first part of the question, like what is the CCP doing, and the persecution of the Tibetan population, things like that, or the short-term, long-term impacts, things like that. I think the biggest mistake that we can make in terms of our creative approach to the issue is to continue framing this, particularly for Tibetan civil society, in what China considers a nationalist perspective. There's a great scholar on Hong Kong, Brian Fong, who wrote a great paper on nationalism. And, China sees itself as a sort of the center of the world, and everything else is along the periphery. So he called this thing center periphery nationalism. There's the Chinese nationalism, and there's nationalism along the periphery. When you talk about human rights, when you talk about security, you talk about environment in the context of populations, and you accuse China of things, and it comes from Tibetan civil society, right? Already, what you are doing is you're leading to what Barry Busan would call a securitization of policy, where something wouldn't necessarily concern Chinese national security issues becomes securitized in this way. And that is a very, very quick way to lead to a political non-starter, a diplomatic non-starter. And this is a challenge for Tibetan civil society, particularly when it comes to human rights issues, because they're always talking about affected populations. They're talking about, and this is a sad thing to say, but it's the state of the affairs we're in. We're talking about historical grievances, right? We're talking about Tibetan sovereignty, Tibetan autonomy, things like that, which are political hot buttons for the Chinese. So that leads to a shutdown. So I was looking at this months ago, because China had its Universal Periodic Review back in January. And it's quite interesting, because China has done a very, very good job of controlling information flow and controlling, to a certain extent, its alliances, its diplomatic partners, to marginalize conversation about Hong Kong, about Tibet, about the Xinjiang region, and to deflect through diplomatic pressure any talk about autonomy and sovereignty and other sorts of identities in the human rights context. Very, very good job of it. And in Tibet, it has also done a very, very good job of ensuring that its partners, particularly Afghanistan and Pakistan and Bangladesh on the other side, right, are firmly influenced by economics, by security partnerships and things like that, right? And if you look at how those particular security and economic partners work within the human rights field, right, they are firmly planted on Chinese soil. If you look at some of the criticisms that were levied, some of the recommendations that were made to China during its UPR, how many countries like, say, Pakistan, Afghanistan, or Bangladesh made ultra-critical comments? Zero. absolutely zero critical comments, right? How many regional countries that surround China, right, that border China, with the exception of India, made super critical, hypercritical comments, very specific policy-oriented comments or recommendations? Zero, right? They are simply not going to do so. So now take this out of the realm of human rights and put it into a security dimension, right? Put it into an environmental context, a collective action problem. It becomes even more difficult, extremely difficult, right? And this goes back to my earlier comment. You know, what can international organizations do, right? Not much, right? And this goes to another thing, okay? Okay, put it back in the context of the United Nations, for example. And at the country level, right, where you have senior UN officials meeting with ministerial level officials at the Chinese level, right? And usually what this happens is it works at the UN country level through what we call a development partnership, or sorry, a development assistance framework or a sustainable development assistance framework, things like that. I read months ago China's UNDAF, or Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. And I Googled it, not Googled it, but I searched it a few days ago in preparation for this forum. How many times does it mention security across the 45 pages? 10 times, right? But only in the context of food and social security. How many times is Tibet mentioned? 0. In terms of the environment, what kind of issues are prioritized by the United Nations for issues like climate change, you know, at the national level, right? This includes all areas of China. There is priority 2, which is achieving green development towards a more sustainable and resilient environment, right? And this is there's an outcome related area where people in China and the region, they call it, right, benefit from a healthier and more resilient environment. Tibet would fall into this.
Right.
Well,
Right.
the negotiation is that the United Nations would work under the Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, the Stockholm Convention, the Montreal Protocol, right, and the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, right?
Right.
None of those things have anything to do with Tibet. None, right? None of those things. So why is that? Why is that? Because, and this is really a really important point, is that nothing that the United Nations done or can do in China can be done without the permission of the Chinese government. They must mutually agree on collective outputs, on collective partnerships. Anything that's going to be injurious, right, or securitized simply won't be agreed upon. And if the United Nations works at the country level on issues that involve security or Tibet or, you know, in this sort of normalized conversation, it's a good way to get yourself PNG'd from the country, right? Simply out. You're going to be kicked out as a diplomat, right?
Yeah.
So it's really, really important, right? So how effective can the United Nations be at the country level? 0.
Thank you.
Very difficult question to answer. Very difficult issue to get a whole handle on in a very short amount of
Thank
time. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Sering, over to you. Then I'll come to Ute and Jonathan.
Yeah, on the
Sering,
same question.
2 minutes. Yeah, for the same questions.
Yeah, I agree with Mark about how difficult it is, you know, to get Tibet on the agenda of international organizations generally, particularly in the United Nations, where China has, you know, sort of entrenched itself, and has actually expanded its presence and influence through funding and all types of influence campaigns. And I also agree with the importance of being sort of creative and strategic in sort of raising issues by Tibetans and other people generally, so that there is higher chances of that issue becoming sort of part of the agenda and getting some kind of attention. But I would push slightly back on how Tibetans sort of should approach issues like climate change, and sort of that whatever the Tibetans say, Tibetan civil society will be received with sort of securitization by the Chinese side, because on issues to do with Tibet, however the Tibetans approach it, raise it, what kind of language they use, inevitably it gets securitized, right? Whether it's coming from civil society outside or by Tibetans inside Tibet. Just to give one example, earlier this year, in Tunrim County, which is Sinicized as Tongring County in Qinghai, the local government published a brochure on sort of banning 20 different acts of support for Tibetan independence. And there are 20 different items in it, but it also bans Tibetan advocacy on environmental and climate change issues. Right? It bans Tibetan advocacy on language rights. Right? By Tibetans inside Tibet raise these issues without talking about Tibetan independence or autonomy or anything, just sort of trying to gain greater sort of education or use of Tibetan language or environmental and climate change issues, they get securitized, no matter how Tibetans raise it and what kind of language they use. So unless the Tibetans, just give up any kind of fight or advocacy and just resign to, all the Chinese policies, there's no way other than to just raise these issues and try to get attention and, the alternative is just to give up as a Tibetan group, or strictly looking at it from the point of view of whether China will securitize a particular issue or not. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Sering. Ute, over to you.
Thanks. Maybe to start with Tsering's comment, the best that you would be to give up, and luckily Tibetans still don't give up. And as recently, like I think it was sometimes in end of October in Ngawa Prefecture, contemporary Sichuan province, there was a Tibetan putting a video on Chinese social media accusing a Chinese company that they're using illegal extraction of sand and gravel from local riverbeds. The video made it on the social media, was censored, and this young Tibetan, he was charged for disturbing social order and provoking trouble and picking quarrels for raising any concern. So there's what we call the securitization in Chinese style, to make sure that nothing is harming national security. Any activists, whatever is done, is everybody is charged for harming national security. And also a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, just another activist who was in prison for 15 years. He was just recently released. His brothers are still imprisoned, but it still shows Tibetans keep fighting. So I think what still should be done within Tibet, even though it's very risky for Tibetans. But on the other hand, to see that there is also other ways of Tibetans. There is also a Chinese Tibetan influencer in Lithang, also contemporary Sichuan province. He became famous under his Chinese name Ding Chen on TikTok, and he's promoting the great green development in Lithang area, and he's also the so-called tourist ambassador of Lithang area, and he even got a fixed job with salary from the government for promoting the green development. So this is a very on the local level in terms of CCP's objectives. Also, like giving a Tibetan nomad a job as an influencer or a salary as an influencer is also the aim of the poverty alleviation. Also in terms of so it's all under what we call the Chinese propaganda. But in terms, just to keep it also short, what can the international community or international organizations do? As already, I completely agree with Mark and what saying. It's really difficult, and the main issue I just want to highlight is when negotiating with China anything on Tibet. China seems to be afraid to be confronted with China's sovereignty. And China doesn't want to be questioned about their territorial claims. So discussing anything on Tibet should be, in my understanding, in a transnational issue, like also including Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all the neighboring countries, and so on. But as we mentioned, as I think Mark mentioned, the national issue, nationalism. So put the topic Tibet alone aside and took it as a Chinese thing or China thing.
That's it.
So, thank you. Jonathan, over to you. Mark, we'll come back to you. Let's finish with Jonathan.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. So I agree with the impotence of the intergovernment organizations, and if you take China's commitment to COP29, so they keep hanging on to the developing world status, which means only voluntary contributions, financial contributions, even though they're the world's second largest, or by some measure, largest economy. And they don't want to do anything about a net zero economy until 2060. Well, that's not really going to fly very well. They're 50% of global coal consumption, and they're producing about 60% of their electricity from coal-fired power stations. So they are the main contributor to climate change. Look, I've read an article countering hegemonism in the Indo-Pacific that you can read more about this. It's got that in there. And my suggestion is that we focus on the supply side. So the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries intervened in the global market and pushed up the price of oil. You could do the same with coal. So Australia is actually the world's largest exporter of coal, and there's only about 6 or 7 states that make up the export market for coal. So my suggestion is we use a little bit more of a mercantilist approach rather than liberal institutionalism, and we form this organization of coal exporting countries and put the price of coal up. And we could pull the money into research into environmentally friendly technologies, or even providing some data collection and global governance. And by pushing up the price of coal, you're not only going to have an impact on the Chinese output of CO2, but everybody. So that's my suggestion, but I agree, limited capability to do it through intergovernmental organizations. That very quickly on the second, or your first point about securitization, I think the big question is why, and Uti mentioned sovereignty. It's really got to do with the narratives, the big grand narratives, the purpose of China. So the center of humiliation, claiming the territorial space of the Qing dynasty. And if you say anything about Tibet, then you're really challenging the whole narrative of the Chinese Communist Party. And so you end up with these atrocious cultural genocide activities inside Tibet. And that's, I suppose, a way. When is China going to be a satiated great power? When will it be comfortable in its own space to be able to say, okay, we can actually allow a discussion about Tibet? Kevin Rudd's recent book, ex-Prime Minister Rudd, and I've argued a similar. I've had discussions with him about this. It's really we probably have to wait for a change in policy from China. Kevin Rudd says it's when President Xi leaves. I'm not necessarily that specific, but basically you have to wait for a reawakening inside China to say we value a clean environment. And Uti's points about the influences, etc., is great. And in 2021, they did stop funding coal-fired power stations overseas. So, there's movement there, right? And so it's possible, yeah.
So before Mark, thanks, Jonathan. Mark, before I come to you, there is one more additional question on the water issues. So let me read that, and probably I would invite each one of you just to comment very briefly in 30 seconds or one minute. The question is from Tom Hart. He asks, I wonder if the distinguished analyst would care to say anything about what not only the region but the entire world can expect in not the preset but decades forward. All 168 glaciers in the Tibetan regions are said to be melting. This means continued water in Asia's rivers for the time being, but in a not too distant future, they are likely to have much less water, which will inevitably lead to all sort of crises. Might China, for instance, attempt to deviate river flows, etc.? So maybe I would invite, starting with you, Mark. We have less than 2 minutes. But we have 4 speakers, so I'll be fair to each one of you. Each one of you maybe 1 minute, so that we'll try to wind up in 5 minutes maximum. Over to you, Matt.
Okay, so let me be quick about I want to respond to the last question first. When I said securitization and the nationalism thing, did not suggest at all that civil society in Tibet just needs to be quiet or sit down. No, what I'm saying is you take it out of the framework of nationalism. And what I probably should have done is been a little bit more clear and say that, we can't have to stop talking about the historical grievances, which automatically put it into nationalism, which also makes it into sort of a securitization framework, and talk about not Tibet, but the whole region. And one of the problems is that civil society, I think, in Tibet is not necessarily equipped to deal with climate change issues. I think that might be a capacity problem. Now, the second question is a really interesting one. And I think we can learn some lessons from the Mekong River in the second question, which is proposed by Tom Hart, is that the Mekong River has sort of had the opposite effect, rather than the steady flow of water, right, coming down because of the melting glaciers. But the Mekong River has had a sort of a flood of dams, and China sort of turned off the taps on the water, and the Mekong River, the lower Mekong River countries experienced a lot of drought, and a lot of sort of riverbeds and whatnot went dry, right? And the problem is, how do you adapt to extreme conditions, right, where they either have too much water, right, or a lack of water? And both of those issues, right, in the Mekong River and in the Tibetan rivers, are going to continue to be a problem, because climate change, even if China gets its act together, right, isn't going to go away, right? What happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. What happens in in Europe, in Japan, will impact Tibet. It's a global issue. So the deviation of the river, right, the transnational boundary management, all really, really, really important, right? But the most important thing that they can do at the moment, right, regardless of the outcome, whatever China wants to do, right, is climate adaptation and mitigation strategy. And that also means climate financing, right, in these issues. So all of the downriver countries, and I'm talking about, or upriver countries, so Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all those have to prepare for the challenges ahead. So this is a really, really important issue, and I'm glad that Mr. Hart brought this up.
Thank you. Then may I invite Sering to comment quickly?
Yeah, this is related to a point that I wanted to mention earlier with regard to how climate change and environmental issues in Tibet can be raised and get greater attention from China, right? What I wanted to say was at the moment China is able to sort of stall discussions around Tibet in the international institutions and in other platforms, because it's mostly just Tibetans talking about it. But I think China will take it seriously if the countries that rely on Tibetan waters or will be affected by climate change in Tibet get together and come up with a united front. If I can sort of use that word, Southeast Asian nations having sort of issues with not just Mekong River, but also Irrawaddy and Salween, and rivers that go to Pakistan and India. If these countries which have common sort of issues with regard to China's management of the Tibetan rivers, and come up with a united front, I think China will, and then talk about Tibet and not Tibet, but the issues there in the international platforms on a united front. Then I think there will be greater attention. But just to go back to the previous point, when Tibetans talk about it, there's inevitably some sort of relevance or relation to Tibetans' rights or historical issues. There is that, but there's also a great deal of Tibetan presentations of the climate change issues in Tibet, that have nothing to do with these kind of issues. They spend a lot of time talking about the impact on neighboring countries, whether it's food security, water quality, and all of that, and also the global sort of dimension of the crisis. So they do, talk about these issues without dealing with Tibet a lot as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ute.
Thanks. Just to make it very short, in terms especially of the lack of water, and there's much less water, and about China's dealing with the rivers, and as already mentioned before, as I call it, like mainland China is not really suffering and really seeing itself lack of water. Still, economy first, economic development first. The growth is more important. Currently, Tibetans and the neighboring countries, especially like I've just been to Ladakh, and Ladakhi nomads, they have no water, they have less animals, they have to fetch water with cars. TCVs in Ladakh have no water, they have to fetch it also with trucks for a daily basis. And as long as I think the lack of water and the impact of the climate crisis is not affecting mainland China, I think nothing is really changing because they just hear it from hearsay, but they cannot feel it. It has so far no impact on the daily life.
Thank you. Last but not least, Jonathan.
Yep. So once again, very, very short. So the Chinese population is set to decline. So I think that's less water is probably going to be required. But then as you industrialize, you use more water. So there's a bit of a give and take there. In terms of diverting rivers, China is fantastic at infrastructure, and they would definitely be the country to do it. They've definitely got the technology and the engineering capability to divert rivers. The Australian diversion system, I know the Chinese have toured that in Australia. And I suppose finally, in terms of what happens next, it's, to my mind, the best thing to do is to change the story, change the narrative. That's contextualizing decisions and making what's right and wrong. And we need to move on from the historical legacies and move on to something which affects all of us. And demographic transition is the way to go. I've got an article out on that as well, if you want to read that. And if we all focus on getting from the billion people that we had in sort of the 1750s or so to the 10+ billion, UN's saying that's going to happen around 2080 now. And then have a stable population and be able to stabilize the economy. So I would advocate let's all focus on that rather than some kind of ideological approach. We need to have a global system. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would just reply very shortly to Tom Hart and other participants that this last question about water, we are going to hold a discussion about the water water conditions in Tibet and China's hydrological projects at some stage. So please follow our website. There will be few rounds of webinars and discussions. And at some stage also, we plan to invite some of the Chinese scholars to hear their part of the story. So hopefully they would agree to discuss some of these issues, sensitive issues. But as part of any academic freedom of opinion and academic exercise, we encourage a transparent debate, a much more open debate, and we respect each of your views, including the views of those who do not really think that there is a crisis has emerged. But from our point of view, from where I do see, I think this crisis is already arriving there, and we need to do something. And probably the international community must, step up to collaborate and take the matter in its hand urgently. With this note, on behalf of ISDP, on behalf of our directors, Dr. Nicholas Swanson and Dr. Swante Kannal, let me thank all of you, all the esteemed speakers for joining today. Your insights, remarks have been really interesting. It will help us to build a narrative about our studies that we are focusing currently in ISDP under the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs. We are going to focus more on the Himalayan regions, on China-India relations, on China's relations with the Himalayan countries, that is Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and other countries, and also on China's foreign policy and domestic issues, including some of issues relating to Tibet. And also we want to inform to all of our participants for, thank you very much for joining today, wherever you are. But I'm sure you have found this discussion, a kind of very useful for your knowledge. And we would also encourage you to, email and subscribe some of our newsletter in ISDP so that you stay informed of our future activities, of our future publications. We are actually going to invite some of our experts today to contribute an essay and probably to give timely interviews on the subject. So you could have much more, insights from these experts in times to come. So again, I will be thanking all of you for joining today. And also I take this opportunity to thank my ISDP colleague, Jana Yarmuth, who is in the background and helping us for this event. And also my two intern colleagues, Lena Fargier and Alexander Drup, who have been really backbone about arranging this webinar and been helpful to me personally for organizing this. Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening. I'm sure this is very late for Jonathan and sharing, and also for Mark. But have a very good evening and good week ahead. And Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Same to you guys.